Let's get this going. So I'll do a real quick introduction about the lens of this class. So I bound, and we'll get into that here in a little bit, to Azure AD. And when I'm talking about modern Office, I'm really talking platform native, right? So in the sense of abandoning all the things we've thought of in the past, from an Active Directory and bringing Active Directory over and how we would. So this is completely focused on a cloud native place, essentially. There's obviously conversations around hybrid. There's conversations around bringing that in, but I'm trying to reimagine what the protection surface looks like if you don't have an Active Directory attack surface as your primary. So that's one of the pieces. Is this is going to be focused on from the lens of modern, as Microsoft quote unquote terms it. So let's get right into it. I don't have many slides, but I'll start out with my background. First off, I put the camera in here just so it feels like I'm in Zoom and I'm not talking to humans at this point. But anyways, I worked for Chris Hoos at Choose Networks. I started when it was 7 of us as a break-fix organization back in 2011. And in 2011, we started the whole seats on a bus and the Peakonomics and SLI and all the things. And is anybody familiar with Choose Networks in here or Iconic? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so at that time, we had about $1 million in revenue, give or take, is where we kind of really started the needle when I joined. And we grew that until we merged with 4 of our HTG peers. So we had been in the same HTG group for, I guess I have to call it evolve and do some push-ups now, but same HTG group for 4.5 years, did a very long due diligence period, and ultimately merged with Live Consulting, Capstone, and NetRes out of Dallas to form around a 22 million or so revenue MSP. And when we did that, we were all 100% Azure AD native. And we've since then bought, I say we, I'm no longer with Iconic, but at that time, we had purchased 3 more companies since then as well. I did not have a beard at some point. I just figured that was fun to throw in as a slide, but it started as a goatee, as a joke with my sales guy, not relevant. And then I also wanted to talk about why I do this and why I want to give back and why I want to help grow, as I love my family and I love our way of life. And I will say that our way of life is categorically threatened right now from a cybersecurity perspective. And so if anybody doesn't know me, I'm a very heavy cybersecurity proponent and driving that inside MSPs and enabling MSPs to help solve the SMB crisis today. And so basically, I want to talk about my journey with modern. So ChooseNetworks.com cut over our SPF record first 7 years ago in 2014 to Office 365. I don't want to talk about the SPF mistake I made the first time and had to do the second one that caused me some real challenges, but you live and you learn as an engineer, right? And then in 2018, we bound straight to Azure AD. Is everybody familiar when I say AADJ or Azure Active Directory joined? I'm going to be a little ELI 5 here, guys and gals, but I just want to make sure I've got it covered. So we at that time started down the journey of Intune. We bought an M365 E3 license, a security and mobility bundle to go along with our license, so it included Intune. And we have been bound in every stage through Choose Networks and Iconic's growth since then, since early 2018. What I like to say, when you live with Microsoft on the bleeding edge, you often bleed quite a bit, unfortunately, with Microsoft. And so, a lot of technicians had a lot of frustrations through those endeavors. But in the same breath, what I was trying to do was protect the 40 million in revenue that we had grown to. And this was the easiest path for me to ensure compliance and make sure that things were encrypted in the right way for us to meet our SOC 2. So I've been doing this for a while. It's gotten substantially easier in the last year or two, with Microsoft committing to the MEM side of things and modern being a defined thing inside Microsoft, and a lot of them getting together and bringing some of these compartmentalized things in Microsoft into a much more cohesive deliverable. But it's still kind of stupid and tough to work through all of their mistakes and nomenclature and separation, and Microsoft's not here to hear me say this right now. So, but that's what I'm hoping to dispel, is some of that. So I also want to start with what is security, in my opinion, and everybody take it for granted. These are my opinions, but security, we often think of it as, and our vendors have told us, and I love vendors too, so don't take me wrong, but security is that next tool, or security is that next protection against that next risk, or security is that, and I don't think that's right. If you think through what is security, security is really about people. Right? It's about the ability to understand who's accessing things, who are your people, do they access it in the right way, have they patternistically changed in some way as a threat actor now? But ultimately, it's about people, and it's about data. And it's really about knowing where your data is, knowing how your data is consumed, knowing how your data flows through an organization. And the challenge is that as technicians, and I point the finger at myself here, we really thought of security as making sure we had our antivirus and our firewall, and then we had email protection, and then as new threats came up, it was the next iterative next ad, and we've all struggled through, well, how do I tell my client I need a new tool, and how do I have a conversation? And I think it's because we've had the conversation all wrong. It has to be data centric, right? It has to be, this is what is at risk, this is what your risk is, this is what your risk is to your clients, and here's the things that are coming up that help us fight the challenges as they develop. And so you start thinking of security as an iterative process, right? A process focused on data, focused on protecting intellectual properties inside the companies, and it brings it as a different conversation. And every time I've had those conversations with clients, focused on data, focused on security, focused on what I think is real security, it's a much easier conversation when you say, I got to change this tool, or I've got to buy this, or we have to do that. It was much more two people sitting at the same table rather than a vendor or a commodity. And so I think security is our way to not be commoditized as much, and allow us, when they say, oh, somebody's having a price hike, doesn't matter. My CPA has a price hike. It's unfortunate, but I still have to do my taxes, and I still have these things that I trust them from. So what is, how do we protect data, and what are the things you have to think about? And is everybody familiar, or is anyone familiar with the CIA triad? Not Triforce, this triad. Got some nods, fantastic. So everything about data is either categorized as confidentiality challenges, integrity challenges, or availability challenges. As technicians, most of my world was focused on availability, right? It was, the server's got to be up. I better have access to this. Well, do you want to know if it's integritous? Do you care if the data's been changed? If an internal employee is changing QuickBooks? If somebody's doing, those are the type of things that get into that integrity aspect, right? That start talking about, is the data I'm looking at integritous? Confidentiality, can someone else read it that shouldn't, right? If we start thinking of data and its compartmentalization and where it's valuable, we start understanding that the confidentiality is also another breach. And so if we think about ransomware, for example, ransomware has two challenges that we all think about, confidentiality or integrity and availability, right? In the sense, it's encrypted, I can't use it. It's no longer available in its current form. My business is down, right? In the same breath, it's an integritous problem. It's no longer the same data. It's been changed. It's been encrypted. It's been in a form I can't touch it. But it's also now a confidentiality problem, right? In the sense that egression of data is part of all malware now, as far as ransomware, major ransomware players right now. And so they're going to take that data and put it out where people that should not have access to that data now could theoretically have access to that data. And so if you start trying to think through data security as, am I affecting confidentiality? Am I affecting availability? Or am I affecting integrity? Or am I affecting all three? That's really the best framework for me to have conversations with clients. It's referred to as the CIA triad. It's part of almost every major cybersecurity training that's out there. But I just wanted to have some base layer conversations on that. And additionally to that, I want to take just a second to talk about what's changing in our industry, and people are starting to be more aware of controls and be more aware of frameworks. And so frameworks and controls don't necessarily secure you. They're great. If you go towards them, you have a much better chance of reducing the bell curve risk. I will say that, right? But what frameworks really give you as an MSP is defensibility, not the ability to defend, but the ability to stand up in front of 12 of your peers and say, I did what I should under due care. I did the things that someone else has laid out in a very auspicious way and said, hey, follow these, do these controls, these 18 CIS controls, or CSA's, cloud control matrix, or cybersecurity security maturity model, CMMC certification. But as you go down those paths, you have defensibility with your clients. As you're talking about it, I'm not making this up. I'm following the CIS controls, and it says you can't be a local admin on your stupid computer. Sorry, we need to figure that out somehow, right? And so these are the things where we've always been shooting from the hip. And I kind of take us back to doctors in the 1800s, right? I think there were like 3 or 4 diseases we knew how to solve, and they were either leeches or a saw at that time, right? It was pretty limited. But as they've grown, doctors have had to, in some way, grow thousands of diseases they know how to work from. And yet they have guides, they have schools, they have licensure, they have restrictions to entry. We don't. Nothing. There's nothing that says I know what I'm talking about to sit here. And so part of our industry challenge is that if we don't find ways to have clients believe what we're saying in a way that's outside of ourselves and outside of shooting from the hips, then we have some challenges. So I look at the control frameworks as a great method to kind of help give you some legitimization when you're speaking with your clients, right? So if you align with those, you start to tie your tool sets to those, you start to tie your actions to those, you can start showing where you're adding value that's not just this stupid SKU that went up 20%, right? I'm actually doing something that helps you stay in business. All the time where our clients don't really get that, in my opinion. Most of them are really kind of willfully ignorant towards their risk and what it means to them as a business. And don't worry, they won't get little old me. So I wanted to kind of preface why I went down the M365 journey and why I think M365, as it's applied, can help you solve some of these framework challenges very uniformly across your clients, in the sense that you can do scripts that now take over humans, right? As you start seeing normalized variables, as you start seeing everybody's M365, everybody's bound to Azure AD, everybody's bound. I can now use the Graph API to write things that happen in an automated fashion that make my user experience great, that make my users and clients more profitable, right? And things that let me scale. So I think we're seeing this kind of really burgeoning age of us being able to really scale MSP services with just hiring consultants, with just hiring people that can come talk about privacy and data security and those things, and not as much wrench turning. So I just mean that not in a negative way. I was told I'm not allowed to use plate spinner in my old organization, but we're getting rid of some of those plate spinning actions of server updates or reboots or these things and building. No, it's all script. That's infrastructure as code, operations as code, which kind of brings me into infrastructure as code. And I'm bastardizing this a bit, ladies and gents. I apologize if anybody wants to poke me on this. You're right. But I look at infrastructure as code and platform as a service as kind of the methods that deliver this world. And what I mean by that is we're probably not going to be doing Ansible scripting. We're probably not going to be spinning up these Kubernetes clusters and things, because we're not developing apps. But what I mean more is that if I have a predictable variable, if I have a predictable input source, then I can have a predictable outcome. And so we can start making our infrastructure of these client systems in platform services as kind of a script, onboarding as a script, if you will. We've always tried to do that with RMMs. We've tried to do that with different components, but none of them had an inherent native cloud layer access to the machine at the minute it starts up. And as we start thinking about what that means, it means that we can adhere to a platform, whether that's Google, whether that's Microsoft, whether that's AWS as it develops, whether that's Apple as they continue to understand the business value of what they're doing. The ability to bolt into that platform and say, I can guarantee this predictable outcome based on these predictable variables, makes it a much more consumable service. And so platform services compared to IaaS, I don't know if I'm getting a little bit deep, but with infrastructure as a service, you're obviously spinning up a VMware cluster somewhere that you don't have to manage the hardware. You're abstracting from the hardware layer of managing virtual machines. But with platform services, you lose a lot of control. You actually don't have any of the hardware infrastructure. You don't have any of the control of what the platform changes, how they charge, which is the new conversation right now in Microsoft, right? But what you do have is the ability to add value on top of that. My 1040 looks the same as everybody else's 1040, right? My K1 looks the same as everybody else's K1. Where the value is when my CPA sits down and says, I can do this, and if you do that, we can take advantage of safe harbor and we can move. Those are things that now, as we have one platform that we've adopted to, we can actually start adding value in other ways and changing the narrative with our clients. And so that's what this is. M365 is a platform. That's the one I'm going to dig deep into today. But I just wanted to kind of set the stage on that. So that's pretty much my start to this. Does anybody have any questions yet? Or want to say you're an idiot? I'm good with that too. Nobody just wants to say you're an idiot? Like, that's fun. Okay, fair. So we'll kind of continue on. Let's get out the syllabus here. Does everybody have M3 or a business premium? Is anybody participating? Is anybody going to try to set up and do devices and go through that with us? 1, 2, a lot of you. Great, fantastic, awesome. So let's get my syllabi out here. And what I want to kind of cover first is some of the key components. So let's look at Azure Active Directory. I'm going to go down this list and kind of look at the sites and talk about them a little bit. If you have questions, that'll make this last longer. If not, we'll end a little early. But the main component I think you need to understand is Azure Active Directory. It is a somewhat flat group structure, unlike traditional Active Directory with its hierarchical nature, but it allows us to have an identity. Right, so identity is the first part of this, and Azure Active Directory has been what's been behind Microsoft Office 365 for the last forever years. It is basically your users and your devices, right? So this is database number 1. There are 3 databases we'll cover here, and Microsoft is disjointed in that, and so there are 3 separate databases for the delivery of this service, and so that helps to understand. Azure Active Directory is the first place, and I call it scraping against AAD. If you sign into a service, if you consume a web service, if you open up Outlook and sign into it with your Microsoft account, you're now scraping against the edges of Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory can make some decisions. Traditionally, that's, do they sign in? Are they part of this group? Should they have access to these files? It's that core infrastructural part. So the components of Azure Active Directory here are And again, you guys probably know most of these things, but okay. So the components of Azure Active Directory, and that is aad.portal.azure.com, because it is a Azure service. Does everybody, so one of the things I also want to kind of codify is that when people think of Azure in general, and this is Microsoft's own fault in their own marketing challenges, but when people think of Azure, they think VMs. They think infrastructurally. They think about, I'm going to migrate to Azure. That is not this conversation today, right? This is not about taking a VM out of your local office and moving that domain-controlled server up there and doing those. This is a different part of Azure, and so Microsoft didn't do themselves any favors. But aad.portal.azure.com is the Azure Active Directory portion of Azure, and it is not an infrastructural product. It is a platform product. Microsoft sprinkles their infrastructural products in with their platform products in some ways, right? So that makes it even more challenging to discuss. So here at 7+1 Labs, we find ourselves in Azure Active Directory, aad.portal.azure.com, if you guys can see that. And we're presented essentially with the first part, with our users, with our tenant ID that we're all familiar with. This is the underlying tenant ID of Azure Active Directory that you get asked for sometimes in certain products. And then you'll have your UPN-based primary domain, right? Whether that's 7+1labs.com, whether that's internal.onmicrosoft.com if you haven't changed it. And it'll tell you your number of users, the number of groups, right? Applications, devices. And by this just means what device has touched the surface of Azure Active Directory. So from which device did you sign in when you were accessing your Google Chrome-based tab, or your, I'm lying, it's mainly when you get into thick apps, but the point's the same. So it looks at devices in this unmanaged, non-Microsoft endpoint management state, just the actual hash ID of them in Azure AD. And so obviously you can create users. When you go into Microsoft Office 365 and create a user, it is just creating a user in Azure Active Directory. Those are one and the same. It's the same user object. That database is the same database. So this is not one of our 3 separate ones. You can get sign-in logs, right? And so what's beautiful about this is Azure Active Directory is the first entry point for access. And I like to say, identity is the new endpoint, or identity is the new edge. By that I mean, it's not so much that we can define a walled garden with a firewall and then access out, and that's our edge. And no, the identity is this person accessing sensitive data, right? Back to our security is people and security is data. And so this is the main place where you're going to see every time Matt Lee's signed in, what he signed in from. Actually, that wasn't me, so that's good. But what are they signed in from? And all of the logs are here. You can extend these logs. You can send these logs somewhere to keep them. They're somewhat ephemeral. Is everybody aware that the Microsoft Azure Active Directory logs are very short-lived in their time frame? Okay. What's that? Gosh, you would ask. I say, if I remember correctly, it was 90 days. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, and then you can extend that beyond? No? Okay, I think it's 90 days. You can send it to a workspace in Azure Sentinel or to Azure. It's very simple, it's cheap, and you can send those there to be looked at forever. So that's a very good idea to do. And I think it's just storage costs, so it's almost nothing to add that. But Microsoft doesn't tell you until you're looking at that email compromise that came in, and you're going, okay, when did they first sign in? Shoot, I can only see 90 days back, right? And so you have this challenge of, how long has the threat actor been here? More than 90, right? So, not great. So, yeah, not good. And then you also have, after that, your audit logs, right? So you have your who changed what, where, and why. Was there a user modified? Was there a password reset? What was done? An app role assignment? And so between your sign-in logs, which is just your pure, did a user sign in? Did they meet conditional accesses? And we'll kind of get into that here in a little bit. Did they satisfy the requirements to actually sign in? And then the audit logs are much more on the other side of that, which is what did people do and where. Password reset in the Azure Active Directory screen is really important. What you're setting here, and I'm just going to kind of go down it, but what you're setting here is your self-service password reset. By that it means if you have MFA in place and you want to allow your users to reset their own passwords, you can set that up here to say all users can reset their passwords, or selected users can reset their passwords from outside. Admins can always reset their users. I hope none of your users are admins, right? That's not so good. It happens, but it's preferential not to be. And this is actually, in my opinion, good and dangerous. What I mean by that is if you allow SSPR, self-service password reset, you should have some other compensating control they cannot reset. MFA, perhaps, a secondary third-party MFA, something that allows you to say, okay, I'll make it convenient to reset one part, but I'll force you to go through some control, and this is my opinion, to reset if it's for us at Iconic, we did that with Duo. They could not reset their Duo. They could not add a new phone to their Duo. They could not add a U2F token or a FIDO2 token to their Duo, but they could reset their password. And what we found was most of the time they were either going to have a challenge with MFA or they were going to have a challenge with their password, not usually both. And so it's to stop the threat actor from resetting the password and then subsequently resetting Duo and going through that same path with same contact methods, same preference methods to reset that. So just wanted to point out that self-service password reset is valuable, but just do it with some degree of thought around it. You could scope it too. If you have some users that you know are internal, good users should be able to reset. You could set a group for self-service password reset as well. So authentication password reset methods. This is where you would set, in addition to that password reset, how many methods they have to reset. So you could actually add some additional controls in that way to say, okay, I've got to have access to the email, which might be good or not. You might have a Gmail account that's out and compromised, access to the mobile phone, and or security questions in Office phone. The rest of this gets into registration around them to register for the new, what do they call this? The modern combined sign-in experience. I can't remember the name for it, but essentially Microsoft has kind of revamped over the years the different methods of MFA. I'm sure we've all played down that list. This one's basically saying, hey, make them register for all the components they're going to need for this reset when they are a new user, when they're going through that process. On-premise stuff, we probably won't get too deep into that. I'm trying to stay high level here. Let's see, so after users, we get into groups. Let's go back to our parent here. So groups are the same thing as you would think in any other capacitance, right? Are they in the group, are they not? What's great about these groups, though, is there are different methods for groups, right? You can actually create groups that are dynamic groups or static groups. I don't know if you guys know the term, but on the dynamic group side, you can actually set principles that say, okay, if they meet this criteria, let's say it's, the device name, for example. Let's say you're kind of segmenting out by device name. You can say, okay, once the device is named this, bring it into this group and do these things. And so you could actually make some automation based on naming. It's got some risks, but you can make some automation based on naming that allows you to set up group membership to be somewhat of this temporary nature, right? Maybe if you wanted to wipe something, you might change it to a group name of wipe or something, right? And that would do that. But just remember there are different types. The other thing that I want to point out here on groups is there's a little box down here that says Azure AD roles can be assigned to this group. This is critical. It's kind of actually just pointing out some of Microsoft's own failure as they've built this. But essentially what this is saying is because Microsoft's made it to where the newer type groups being created can actually have AD roles assigned to them, right? So you could say this group, PAM's a great example, or Partner Center Access. Until next year when they make some changes to Partner Center, Microsoft doesn't have a great way for you to say all technicians or just two like everybody's either Partner Center admin to all clients or not, and so you have some risk there, right? Because if you said, oh, you're an admin to all of our Partner Center, then all clients. And so what you could do is do a PAM solution with this where you actually have them escalate to be a partner admin and then drop back down 2 hours later, 4 hours later, 48 hours later, whatever you want, so that you can kind of reduce the risk window surface. And so in order to do that, you have to check this. But the reason I'm bringing it up now is if you create it without it, you cannot add it. It would be destroyed and recreated. So just understand that this is one of those things that has to be done at this time. If you want to have access to Azure AD roles, you must check yes now when you create it. You can't go back and retrofit. It's just part of the nature of the change in their group structure. And then the membership type is assigned dynamic user or dynamic device. So the dynamic user is going to pull from our users pool, and the dynamic device is going to pull from the device pool in Azure Active Directory only. So these groups are talking about Azure Active Directory specific in that database. So let's see, after groups, external identities, I'll touch on this really quickly because if let's say you have a very Google-centric client, they're all Google apps, everything's Google apps, but their devices are Windows. And so you're like, well, what users should I use? What are we going to set up an Active Directory domain just to manage this and tie them in? And what I would propose, you can use this section to add in an external identity provider that is Google. Google becomes the identity provider for Microsoft. Microsoft then sends requests back to that IDP for access, password, those type of things. And what that allows you to do is still manage the devices, same identities, same email addresses, Google's the master. trying to use better words. Google is the owner of that identity, as the primary owner of that identity. So just understand what this section's for. It's primarily for having external identity providers and being able to tie those in for that purpose.
External identities for some users and AADDs for other users?
I haven't come across that user case. I don't know that answer. I'm sorry. Yeah, his question was, can you do it for some users and not others? Traditionally, when you add in an IDP that's the parent IDP, it's all. At least in a lot of the cases where I've seen it. But in this case, they may have made it to where you can do it separately. But I would wager, yes. I bet you could have coexisting identities for sure. If the identity doesn't exist over there, that's a good question. I'm going to dig into that now. So let's see, collaboration, link subscriptions. Let's get back in. I'm trying to stay relevant to stuff that matters. Roles and administrators. This is where you're building all of your roles for basically legacy stuff as well as new stuff. Microsoft's making, what is it, like 180 roles or something they have now? But you can have a help desk admin, or you can have a Exchange admin that can only do Exchange. You can have somebody who's doing the compliance auditing, identity governance. But we've always, as MSPs, at least myself and parties I know, have just given it all. There's global admin, global admin. And Microsoft's on a big kick to try to segment some of that so that it is role-based access. It's tied to the things you should be doing. And even more so, if you use these roles in PIM-PAM type solutions, by that I mean privileged access management and privileged identity management, if you use those in that type of way, you could never be a global admin and only become a global admin for need, or only become a local admin on your machine for need. In fact, one of the ones I want to point out is, let's see if they have it easy to find. There's a local admin's role, Azure Active Directory bound. Yeah, here we go. So this is the Azure Active Directory Joint Device Local Administrators Group. And so if you assign someone this role and they're on an Azure Active Directory bound machine, which is what we're going to be going through today, they're now an admin. Now, joke's on you. There's a 30-minute delay or so, give or take, unpredictable, no notice, nothing telling you you're now an admin. So kind of not there yet. But it does make it to where if you have a technician that says, listen, I want to be a local admin, but our compliancy, if you're going down that road, says I can't be, right? And you're going to do the app locker solution or something like that to solve it, or threat locker or whatever it may be, this might be a possible path where you could actually show to an auditor, no, they're not local admins. And when they need to be local admins, they escalate. There's a process. We capture X, we send them this, and we know, and it's documented, and it's back in that audit log we just saw, right? And so you now have defensibility of your actions in a way that you can show that the attack window is only opened when it's needed, when it's based on the need. And so I just want to point out that this roles is what that really is. And as we get more and more centric, these roles will mean the same thing to every client. These roles will mean the same thing to every single thing we do. And so that's where I'm starting to talk about how we can use a platform type service to solve some of these needs in the actual platform as they develop it. So that one's where roles are. Administrative units. Enterprise applications sounds big and hairy. Really what it means, is everybody familiar with SAML or OIDC, OpenID Connect, OAuth 2? So essentially, when you start hearing enterprise apps, this is a great attack, by the way. I love this one. If you can inject an enterprise app and have someone approve it, I don't have to sign in. I don't have to deal with MFA. I'm just going to be in the tenant. I have access to the tenant as a legitimate app. And if you just look at this, there's already, 12 apps in my lab tenant. Go look at yours, and you may find that people have accepted Calendly. That's an example of an enterprise app, right? They've created a one-click, hey, sign up for Calendly, use your Office 365. Click. That created an enterprise application in here. That created something that is a SAML resource that is letting your core identity provider, Microsoft, extend that identity into that service, right? But it's also giving them access to graph resources, to user resources. So if you look at I don't know that I have anything great in here. Let's just look at online. If you look at the rights that are given to these applications, oh, I'm failing here. Where's I have to go to the other enterprise apps. That's the other thing. While I'm here, I'm just going to point it out. There's two sides of enterprise apps. Is everybody familiar with that? There's app registrations and enterprise apps. They both get to the same object, but they have different things in them from Microsoft. So when you go into all applications, you'll see some of these objects appear both places. But my point really is that the permissions that can be given to these applications can be really broad. Some of the good attacks that I've seen actually do send a link that if you look at that link, it's a Microsoft link, Microsoft.com, I'm good, right? but it's really comes up with that little acceptance box that everybody sees and says, please create this app for my user. I'm now that user. If I trick someone into clicking that, it's Microsoft. It can't be filtered. It's not going to be stopped by safe links. I'm in. I own that user. And if they're an admin, I can ask them to give me admin consent to the entire tenant, and I own that tenant. And so enterprise apps are critical. You need to know what they are. They're going to become more and more of your day. Probably not technical, right? In the sense that most of these places like Calendly, they've already made it dummy proof, right? In fact, too dummy proof. And so you'll see that they're going to become more and more of how we do what we do. There's a spot in here though that's pretty critical. So in enterprise applications, we have all applications. App proxies let you bring stuff back to your local org, right? Where you say, okay, it's all fine and well that I have this web app, but I'm going to have it proxy out and use my identity from Microsoft in some ways. And so app proxies are methods to do that. But this one, consent and permissions in that tab. So this is if you can turn this on now, you should. 100%. It stops me being a bad guy. You can say, don't allow user consent, right? So you can go in and say, if Calendly pops up and Johnny or Sally want to use Calendly, they will see a box that says, oh, we've notified your administrator that you'd like to create this application, and as soon as they approve it, you're good to go. Now, it doesn't work. Microsoft hasn't figured out how to make that function well. Like some of these services don't hand off well to a user that was then authorized by an admin. It's just the nature of the way they wrote their app. But what we did at Iconic was we set this to say, no, you can't create your own application. Matt can't send you a link that lets you create an application, lets him have a God mode over that tenant. And so it actually does allow you to do that. And I'd say it doesn't work. 85% of the time it's fine. It's certain ways that those app creations were written that fall apart in this script because they don't let the handshake finish. So like the app stops proceeding because it didn't get the handshake, but the handshake was waiting on your admin. So just take that with a grain of salt. But this is a very good protection. It will not cause a lot of headaches in the sense that your users might come in. When you do it with client tenant, there's some scale problems, right? Especially in trying to support those tickets and you're saying, hey, we're going to block it. But I would give the client the choice. Do you want people to be able to willy-nilly click on something and give away their identity in a way that MFA can't protect them, in a way that can't, grain of salt, everything can be done, but doesn't natively protect them? This is the simple box you save, and you make your email address for that admin come into your ticket system or some form or fashion to be able to track that and manage it. Down the road, and by that I mean like late January or so next year, Microsoft has some solves coming that make this a lot better, but they're rewriting the whole system to do it. So part of that advisory right now. But just wanted to point this out. This stops a video I did on this type of attack pretty handily. So just real quick point out. All right, enterprise applications, you'll see the same sign-in logs, everything's still there, user settings, we don't have to get too deep into. I'll touch on conditional access down the road. This is where those admin consent requests come in. So if you do set up admin only adding enterprise apps or admin permission adding enterprise apps, this is where if a technician needed to go solve that for client 7 and they go into their system, this is where they would go in as that admin and say, yes, I do approve Calendly, that one's fine. But super bad guy, don't want to approve that one. I'm not going to approve that app. And you can do those researches. The GUIDs are the same GUIDs. What I mean by that is if you look at an application and it has its GUID, its globally unique identifier, you can take that GUID and go search Google and start doing some research. There's also some really cool companies grabbing and aggregating data around that. And there's some cool services coming that are going to talk about, is this a good app or is this a bad app? And you'll start being able to see that as you scan tenants. And you'll find evidence of threat actors, most likely, in a lot of tenants that have created these enterprise applications. So awesome. And I think that's good on int apps. So let's go back to Azure AD. Also, the navigation is really rough, and I'm a terrible user, so you guys will get to muddle through that as well. But I usually just go back to Azure AD over here on the left. So we've covered enterprise apps. This is the first device database. When I talked about this before, Azure Active Directory is a different database than Intune, is a different database than Autopilot. Those are your 3 primarily databases. And if people don't realize that, the actions aren't super clean. And I think Paco was telling me about an experience he had where kept trying to fix the machine, wiped and reloaded, kept getting the OX 812 error or whatever it is that says I can't join AAD, not realizing there was 3 places he had to go cleanse that device from in order to make that go away. When you delete an Intune, it doesn't delete Autopilot, and it doesn't always delete the Azure Active Directory objects that existed. And so you can find yourself in a bad way and when you're trying to clean up and recover from that. So just to understand 3 databases, this is the first, and this is the device side of that. You'll see my handy MLE Victim S1 machine. That's because I wanted to have an Azure-bound device to attack that had Sentinel-1 on it and see what my enumerable surface area was, and it's in my lab. But yeah, devices, pretty plain. Device settings. Enterprise state roaming's cool. It's not great yet, but the thought process is that enterprise state roaming lets you, as you're now all Azure AD bound, as you're starting to use multiple devices, they're bringing some of the app data across. They're syncing some of those things between the devices so that if you're using a templated patternistic methodology of deploying, applications through Intune and MEM, then one of the challenges of roaming type stuff in the past was you didn't always have the same templates. You didn't always have the same applications. You didn't always have the same stuff. Your desktop icon's broken. But as you start seeing the ability to make that always uniform, then enterprise state roaming, I think, is going to be great for that user experience of transition across devices. But I don't use it right now, but it is a thing. Bitlocker keys, right? So as we're starting to store those in Azure Active Directory, we're going to start storing the Bitlocker keys. You can also see those from the device objects. So if you get into an encrypted device, these probably won't be, those are cloud PCs, but I believe bad user. I believe my victim is encrypted. Let's see. Nope, okay. But they will show up associated with the Azure Active Directory object. That's where the Bitlocker keys are stored. The other cool thing is users can go and see their own, Bitlocker keys. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but if you sign into Microsoft Online, you can go into your user object and pull your Bitlocker key, especially if you're having challenges with TPM assertion. So your trusted platform module stores cryptographically those keys, the representations of that encrypted key. And so if you've ever had a user boot up and then it gives them the please enter your Bitlocker key, it's usually that the TPM has not asserted appropriately when it booted. And so they can go and self-service and get that key themselves if you educate them properly and make that easier for them to get. The other answer is if you hold, swear to God, if you reboot it, no, if you hard power down those devices, if you've ever seen that where BitLockers are not asserting, and Lenovo was one of the examples of those, but sometimes the TPM coming back from sleep doesn't assert appropriately, and so it doesn't provide those keys to the operating system. And so what you can do is hard power down, pull the power, do the 8 seconds on a laptop, and when you come back up, the TPM could reassert and be fine. And so if you've ever had that challenge and went down and deleted the object and reinstalled and all this, you could have possibly just rebooted. Literally cold boot, right? Remove the power cord, drain the Mobo, start her back up. I've played that game before. We had that at Iconic a lot. So I've said that many times. And they're like, oh, reboot it, Matt. Yeah, no, I swear, really, reboot it. I promise. I'm not kidding. But anyways, just know that you do have the BitLocker key stored in Azure Active Directory. We try to solve that with AD, right? We'll store it in AD and we'll bring your BitLocker key. This just natively functions. It's just natively as soon as it's created is in there. So if you're AAD centric. Not if you're hybrid bound, I don't believe. Any questions so far? Covered anything good? Anybody wants to dig into? We're just in the... Yeah, I didn't have any really good enterprise apps, but you could go into Common Data Service and then go look at your owners. The owner will tell you who created it. So the first person that clicked it and made it is going to be your owner. And then you can also see users and groups that are associated with it. So what you can do is, let's say you found out that somebody went and spun up a Dropbox association with Identity, and they're paying for one enterprise Dropbox application, but you're not using it. We'd buy services just so my users couldn't use it, right? So I'd go stand it up. You could put in here a group associated with this that says, this is the only user group that can do this application. And so when you create that, you're now saying as an administrator, here's the group that should be associated with this. And you can actually be restrictive with that, right? So yes, good question. You can dig into who created it, and you can dig into who all accesses it. And then also if you get into the audit logs on those services, I wish I had something like well, hell, we're in a lab. Let's just go to Calendly. And we'll just sign up. So let's reject cookies. Let's sign up free. We're going to sign up with Microsoft. So mlee@7+1labs.com. And we're going to sign up with Office 365. And so, hey, look, we're at Office 365. Again, those links won't be bad. They'll be login.microsoftonline.com. And so this is what I was talking about before. Thank you. I must have planted you. I appreciate that. This helps me get in some good content. It's very nice. So this app would like to, can everybody see that okay? Okay. This app would like to sign in and read your profile. That's my user object. That's enumeration of my internal users and my profile, my information. They want to read my calendars. Makes sense. It's Calendly. It stands to reason they would have that access. Wants to read and write your calendars. Again, needs to be able to write the object. Totally makes sense. But this box is the one I was talking about as well that says once I set this up, every user now can have access to it. we're going to start as if I'm just Matt, not Matt admin in this. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I am an admin, just to make it easier than switching between. I would recommend you have separate profiles for your administration than your regular user, or you use PAM or PIM in some form. So we'll say accept, and it's going to take me happily in. That's the other beauty of this, right? If you start thinking about extensibility of identity into applications, right? If you talk about mlee at 7plus1labs.com, and my extensibility into anything web provided, any SaaS app, any application someone wants to sell me, if I'm signing in with Office 365, I made the user experience amazing and the risk amazing, right? And so that's what we have to kind of think about here. And so right now we don't have anything preventing this being set up, so it obviously just went right in. And if we go back to our Azure Active Directory Enterprise Applications and refresh, we'll see Calendly in here. And when I talk about these applications, Calendly is a gallery application, meaning that you could have just searched for it in Microsoft, said, I want to add Calendly, and when you went to Calendly, to varying degrees of success, will have already worked. When you go to sign up, it'll say, all right, gotcha. So if you do restrict people and you know your people are going to use Calendly now, or you know your client is going to use some web SaaS application, you could pre-register that in here, right? So I think proof point synchronization of users or those type of things are apps you can pre-register. So if we enumerate this Calendly object and we start looking at it, back to your point, actually it's not quite gone there yet. Okay, so I think the owned is if you do it as an admin. I may have misspoken earlier, but the Matt Lee object now shows that he has access to this. You can go in and say, you know what, I want to let all users come in, but I want to set a group. And so you could say, even if they want to assert, I can make them now have to be in a group. So when you set this setting, user assignment required, it's saying, listen, if this is set, the users must first be assigned to this app before being able to access it. Whether that's a group, and maybe even a dynamic group, maybe a dynamic group based on a sales role in your title, right? Now you say, okay, listen, if you're a sales manager or a salesperson, you probably need Calendly. We're just going to make it automatic that you're in that group based on your role title in Microsoft, right? And so those are the kind of limitations of variables that exist that allow us to start being kind of creative with automation inside the platform. Is it visible to users? Can they see it in their single portal for accessing applications? And then you can come into the groups and say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and make a group of whatever. All users can access this application. So now I'm saying, yes, you have to be assigned first, but you're being assigned because you're a user. So you're all users. And so it just gets you in that muscle and feel of being able to restrict the application use. I could then delete Matt Lee from this user as a direct object, and I would theoretically be present in all users. And if I did sign out of Calendly, I would be able to sign back in. If you took someone out of that and they went to Calendly, what would happen? If they weren't in the user group being allowed into Calendly, Calendly would fail the authentication. And so the point is you can start controlling how people access certain web applications by just saying, yes, you should be in this or you should not. And the more you automate, the more profitable you are. The more that you don't have to have a technician take a ticket to add Sally to this. Nope, Sally's a sales manager. Sally's going to be in this. It's just automatic. Now, you got to fix it when it breaks systemically. If you typed a user, it doesn't say sales manager, it says sales manager or something, right? Then it's not going to work. And so you have some systemic breaks and fixes. But ultimately, that's what the enterprise app side, and yes, you can see who used it. And then you should be able to even see in our auditing down here, sign-in logs, a little bit of Azure delay. But you can see Matt Lee signed in. Matt Lee signed in with single-factor authentication. I think this was when I kind of took my user out, but it gives you the authentication details. It was done with password. It wasn't done with a FIDO token. It wasn't done with something else. So, enterprise applications. I've beat this one to death, but that is the first step into enterprise apps. We've hit devices. We've hit app registrations. Only in the sense that app registrations is a reflection of some of the same objects. You might have an int app that also is an app registrations. Sometimes that gets important if you're having to feed data, like in a SAML response to something. So let's say you're doing a security markup language response to somebody. You might add an extra group ID that you want to add. So like if you want to say this is Wichita, you might add in an extra field that gets pushed over to that receiving entity. App registrations is where you're going to do those type of things. It comes up mainly when I was doing a Duo integration. We wanted to bring a lot more data into Duo through the SAML side, and so we created custom assertions in that space to bring some data across from Microsoft in a new way. I think I'm pretty beat Azure AD to death here. Does everybody feel like we've covered Azure AD, at least as a what it is principle, pretty well? Okay. All right, good. All right, back to my syllabus. AADJ versus AADR. I believe the big, and I actually don't know that that's delineable, but if it was, it would be along the hybrid lines, most likely. I apologize. I've been kind of unilaterally focused on that cloud-first methodology. So AADR is I have a machine, it's signed into Active Directory, or it's got a local account, but I went into work or school and added in some of those pieces. That's not Azure Active Directory joined, but it is AAD registered, it's Intune registered, it's also in that space. So I think that's the nomenclature you're speaking of, correct? Oh, MAM versus MEM, and yeah. True story. Yeah, absolutely. It'll be registered. It'll be manageable in some form, whatever you defined as that manageability plane. Yeah, absolutely. Good point. All right. So sign-in security settings we kind of touched on. Let's look at conditional access. So let's go back. Is anyone using conditional access as a method to control access for security reasons? Raise your hands. Awesome. Okay. So conditional access sounds exactly like it is. If this, then that. If not, then this, then that. Right? And so you're able to set some parameters as data gets more sensitive around access. Right? So the first way we think of it is I want to enforce MFA. I don't want to use the legacy MFA model. I want to use conditional access as the method to enforce MFA. But if you start thinking about conditional apps or conditional access and enterprise applications, you could actually start crafting a story where, all right, we're going to let you in if you just want access. But if you want access to this that's more sensitive, then you're going to have to satisfy more requirements. Your machine might need to be Azure Active Directory joined before you could touch CUI if you were in a CMMC world, right? Or right, you can start setting enforcements that say, okay, great, you've signed in, you're you, but you're not coming from a trusted computing base. You're not coming from what we want. And so if this data is sensitive, can't do that. But if you just want to check your email, you can do that from a web browser, no problem. And so you can actually craft some really interesting stories with conditional access. So let's go look at conditional access. It's in security. They moved it on me a while back. Security. And you don't want to get tricked into clicking this handy dandy, awesome, amazing link. That's just information, documentation, but I've clicked it 1,000 times. You want to click on this conditional access, not the other one they present you. And so conditional access is a set of these basic components that allow you to craft a should they be allowed in or should they not kind of a scenario. So let's start with kind of what it is. These are your policies. You would create a policy that says, hey, MFA, and you would say assign to users and groups, all users, right? And you would then say, if they're in this cloud application, what do we want it to do? All cloud apps, select apps, right? You can say, for just Office 3, for Calendly, for example. We want Calendly, you got to come in with this type of connection. And so they're going to be hierarchical, and the more specific you are, it'll take precedence. What you can do is you're crafting conditional access. They have this down here where it's report only versus off and on. I would definitely, and so would Microsoft, caution you with their giant yellow flag to do report only first before you turn it on so you don't lock yourself out of things. But what's great is after you set a conditional access policy, you wait your Azure minute. I say that because a lot of my troubleshooting early on, and I think still even to this day, you set a policy, you think it's going to work, and there's a delay before Azure actually replicates that to the endpoints. And so you're testing, you're like, why is this not working? Or why is it working intermittently? The logs will help you sort that out. And so as you start looking at every sign-in in that sign-in section we went into in AAD, those will have a satisfied conditional access, which ones were applied, what wasn't, what would have been applied, where would you have failed. And so you can look at those to kind of say, okay, before I turn this thing on, or expand its scope either way, you can look at what the behavior would have been. So conditional access shows up in those sign-in logs. But if we created this policy, I have to have a grant section. So yeah, we'll say block access or grant access require multi-factor. And this was meant to be kind of a walkthrough, but I'm digging in, so I apologize. But you can also set session controls. This is another one. Oh, I'll get into this. Another huge attack surface reduction. There's a tool called Evil Jinx. It's a phishing tool that I use. It's an attack surface tool in Kali, or actually anywhere you want to put it. But Evil Jinx spins up portals like a LinkedIn portal or a Microsoft portal or anything. It's a poison portal. The certificates match. It looks good, but I'm actually proxying that traffic off through a third party back to my Kali Linux box, and I am actually capturing your password and your username, and as well as your OAuth token. So when you sign into Microsoft, you are generated a session token, right? That session token says this is my lifetime, this is where it's applicable, it has to be in the same browser or it doesn't. Those settings by default are open. Those settings by default are the token will persist forever. The token is available to be ported somewhere else. And if I steal that token, I'm you. I just use the token to authenticate the next time I authenticate. I don't need a password. I'm already authenticated. I'm already MFA'd. I'm me. I'm in. And so when you start thinking about conditional access, I would heavily say, go in here and say it must be a persistent browser session. And say it has to, or only works when all cloud apps. Oh, I have to go back to that. Anyways, it's the same thing, but it allows you to set that token is no longer persistent, that it doesn't live beyond X lifetime. And you can set that in this setting. In fact, what does it want me to do? No, just one app. Okay, hold on. Fix that. All apps. Cloud apps. All cloud apps. Yep. This is that warning I was talking about. Don't lock yourself out, stupid. Wait for it to be created. See, there's your Azure replication. It's back, it's gone. It's back, it's gone. And then down in this session controls, persistent browser. And then what you can say is always persistent, which is the default behavior. If you don't check this, there is no session timeline, how long this is persistent. Is it persistent if you move the browser? Is it persistent? And then you can say, nope, never persistent, which means that if I steal that token and go to use it, it's useless. It's not going to work. I've tested that. I actually have a video of me going, yay, it stopped it. But you can snag that token and it won't let you use that token. You might not even get a token, as a matter of fact, in that way. It's not persistent. And then you can set some other things. But this one's important just because one of the great attacks is stealing your X lifetime token and using that to be you. And so if you can say, don't let that be persistent, then it can't be used outside of that first context the way it's being used in that particular session. So just want to point that out. But conditional access is a set of policies. Yes. Right. Scripting. It kind of comes back to that tenant. When I onboard a tenant, I do these 907 things. And whether we're going to script it or whether vendors are going to start adding those kind of capabilities so that you can have a template, you can have that's my charge, right? You know, in my current day job is driving them to make this where it is secure by default when you onboard them. The challenge you have is you have to set expectations of users, right? You have to say, this is what you will experience different than what you had before. Like presumably as an MSP, you take on a client, you onboard them. Part of that is doing all these setting changes. It's going to change their experience. And we get judged by the experience more often than not. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to automate so that you can have an onboarding that then ultimately sends an email to the client and says, this is what you would experience today when we change this. And it changes that one thing. And then tomorrow, and that becomes a track. Right, that becomes some form of a track that you can defend and predict. Similar to turning on MFA. A user might get an email that says, go set up your phone. And they do that. Yes, sir. Yeah, Azure AD P1 is what you need, which is part of the business premium license as well for this. Am I incorrect with that? Is that a P2 function? I don't think so. It's P1. Yeah. Yeah, so this should be in your business premium. Your user that's the admin might not have that. I didn't say this trick. It's not something you should do. It's not part of their EULA. It is against Microsoft's agreement, but you only need one. So at least to do the settings. But yeah, we'll leave that alone. Same thing with PIM and PAM. PIM and PAM both need P2, but it does function without P2 as long as you have one P2 in the organization. So Microsoft will even say it too and then take it back in calls that I'm on. But short story is, yeah, it should be in your business premium license in order to do these part of these functions. I don't think I actually have a P2, and I think it said I have a P1, so this should be doable with a P1. Yeah. So, persistent tokens. Let's go back to our syllabi. I think we've covered conditional access deeply enough to at least get a rough conversation. Bad user. It's okay. All right, so other nomenclatural things, sign-in, conditional access, AADDS, huge, okay? All right, this is when your client says, oh, that's all fine and well, Matt, but I still have my EMR. I can't get rid of it. It's Active Directory bound. It's a local database. It runs on a stupid server. AADS is probably the answer. And what AADDS is Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So it is your domain services capacitance, $126 a month. But what it does is it spins up 2 endpoints in Microsoft Azure. And we'll go to it now. So this is an Azure product. It's not in AAD. This is actually in Azure proper, as I like to call it. And so Azure proper, I'm at endpoint, I'm at portal.azure. So AADDS, I guess domain services would do it. Domain. Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So I don't have an Azure resource. Okay, we'll just talk about it theoretically. I can't go through it right now. But what it does is it makes a left-hand to right-hand copy, no flowback, from Azure. So mlee at 7plus1labs.com is now a internal service you pay for. It's $126. It shows up in Azure. You have an endpoint. You have to set up subnets. You have to have the subnet defined for Azure Active Directory domain services. But if you brought a server that, let's say, was running on cni.local and it's moving to choosenetworks.com, you move the VM to Azure, unjoin it from the domain, join the domain of 7plus1labs.com by using the two IP addresses they give you in DS. So an internal IP is 10.4.0.7, 10.4, I think it's .4 and 5. But so when you do that, the machine feels like it's in a normal domain. It doesn't know any different. It is in a normal Windows Active Directory domain. And so instead of having an Active Directory domain controller that then syncs to Azure and then syncs to and stays on-prem and you use that for your VM to bind to, you're now binding to the one true object, right? It's just being replicated in Microsoft over to the Azure AADDS object rather than Active Directory being the boss. And why does that matter? If I want to attack, a lot of the attack surface that I will use would be starting at Active Directory and moving to the cloud. Cloud Jumper, Cloud Hopper, those are all enumerative first. Even SolarWinds was a first entry into AD and extensibility through that token into Azure, into Microsoft, into those extensions. I'm over summarizing, but the point being is that if you can get rid of AD, you lose a lot of attack surface. And so Azure AADDS is a read-only instance of what the left-hand hash is. So instead of the passwords being set by some machine and then it's replicated to the cloud, they come from the cloud and get replicated to another cloud service you have no control over. You can also install GPO objects. You can spin up and use the ASPMX templates. You can do things like that in Azure AADDS that lets you support those legacy workloads and workflows. So if you have a client that's wanting to go down this journey, that is a possible path. There's a current restriction right now that I'm fighting to change, and I think I'm going to win. But right now, you're not allowed by the EULA to have a VPN back to your local premise hardware where they just invested $50,000 in a new VMware stack and all their VMs. You're not allowed to extend DS through back to the org over the VPN right now. I've been doing it for 3 years. It does work. I sent it over to AWS. It's functional. And so I actually got with David Bjorman with Microsoft, and they're working on changing that EULA to allow us to use that outside of Azure. Their obvious reason was to make you use Azure VM resources. But if you've already got a client that spent a ton of money on hardware, you could bring the cloud down through the VPN through Azure AADDS. So I just wanted to touch on that object real quick. But we did that at Iconic. All of our lab tech servers, all of those things were in AWS, and they used AADDS as their consumption for their identity. And so we were able to add some more protection surface there. All right. Really quickly wanted to touch on AADDS, but it is a big concept. If you guys are struggling with that, I also wanted to say that I'm going to be doing tomorrow and Sunday, I'm planning on blocking off 5 hours. If anybody wants to just sit down and chat about your actual circumstances and what you're going through, pick my brain. I'd be glad to share my years of this experience. There's my son, John, sorry, looking at me like I'm crazy. So M365 Admin, I think this is probably where everybody has the most knowledge, so I'll kind of just skirt over this pretty quickly, I think. Everybody's used M365 or Office Admin, right? The admin of users. And so there I'm talking about this side of, users. Nope. Yes. Okay. Users. This is where you do your Office 365 Microsoft Exchange settings. This is your traditional admin portal. So when I'm talking about admin.microsoft, I'm talking about M365 Admin. Microsoft hasn't really blended all their endpoint stuff and all their things into this one admin page. So I just want to touch on it, that it is where you would do your traditional admin work. But the users do, Alex Heilman goes back to a AAD object in here. And then the devices that are in here are actually, if I remember, Intune devices, not the AAD objects. They're the Intune database they're pointing at here.